Dr. BJ Miller, thank you so much for being on the show.
No, Patrick, it is a pleasure to be with you, buddy. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Now, I wanted to start out our conversation with a quote from one of my favorite movies, The Outlaw Josie Wales.
Hmm.
And, Clint Eastwood talks to Chief Ten Bear. There's like this very dramatic, climactic scene where they more or less figure out if they're going to go to war with each other. And
Hmm.
Clint Eastwood says, death is easy for us. And it's living that's tough. What
Hmm.
comes to mind when you hear this?
Truth. Oh, big truth right there. And that very much Clint Eastwood or Josie Wales is speaking my mind there too. I find that to be from all that I've observed in my own life and being near others, I think that is a true statement. Of course, I don't really know exactly what happens after we die. So I leave a lot of space. But my sense is this is the tricky stuff. This is the harder stuff.
I would concur with that. So I have to thank Tim Ferriss for having you on his show way back in 2016. Well, I guess it's not that far away, but I listened to the episode and it literally blew me
It feels
away.
like it.
You have such an interesting story. You're
Mm,
such an inspirational person. And then Tim
mm.
has been celebrating his like gazillionth episode. This guy is a machine. I don't know how many episodes
Yeah,
that he's put out,
no.
but he highlighted you on one of his latest episodes, and that triggered my memory. And in
Mm,
16, I didn't have a podcast. I was just a flatfoot, running around Milwaukee after bad guys, and
mm.
but it resonated with me. And then I heard this, and I'm like, oh my god, I wonder if Dr. Miller would actually be on my show. I would love it. So I got to thank Tim Ferriss.
Well, well, thank you, Tim, out there, and thank you, Patrick. I I'm really happy to be here, and it's already a pleasure talking to you. And I got to just say, for the work that I do, which in a lot of ways, I really want to myself and each other. I want us to look at the facts of life. I want us to be real with the lives that we have, and death just happens to be a big part of our lives. And I'm so glad I get to be here with you and to not have to pretend otherwise. And let me also just say for your audience, I mean, the first responders, crew, cops, firemen, EMTs, paramedics, uh, I don't pretend to know what you all go through, but I know you see a lot and a lot of hard stuff. And I would imagine there's not a lot of space to process what you see. So I guess all that is to say thank you for the work you've been doing and your colleagues do and a lot of your audience do. It's invaluable, and I would imagine you don't get thanked enough. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for saying that. That does mean a lot. I think people in their hearts believe that. It may not always come out like that, but
Yeah.
when when you never call the cops for your best day ever. Hey, you know what?
Right.
Things are going awesome. I've got money in the bank, my relationships are great, my kids are healthy. I'm not going to go call the cops. It's like
Right.
when my life is upside down, or I might be literally upside down in a car after a crash or something like that, then we're just going to start using that 911. But absolutely. But you've been around
Right.
a lot of death. I think a statistic that I saw was you've either guided or helped over 1,000 people die. Is that correct? Maybe it's
Yeah.
more.
That's probably true. I mean, it's been, I've been doing this for maybe 20-ish years. And so, yeah,
Okay.
probably something like that.
All right. So, in
Yeah.
that vein, I have to ask, do you believe in ghosts or a presence of a person after they die?
Well, the short answer is yes. The longer answer is I really don't know. But all I can say is the sense that I get. Let me back up for a second. Being sort of educated in the way I was, I have long prized the cognitive mind, our frontal lobes of
Sure.
that's where that's where the best parts are, that's where the progress is. We should really devote ourselves to our thinking minds. And while I remain a big fan of our thinking minds, I have come around to see how much more wisdom lives in our bodies, in our felt sense of things, in our intuition, And I don't think it's so easy to separate our thinking mind from our feeling mind. But all that is to say, I'm all for thoughts and knowledge and science, but I'm also deeply aware that it doesn't answer all the questions or yet doesn't yet answer all the questions that we're faced with on a daily level, on a daily basis. And from all that experience being at people's bedsides and dealing with death in my own life, all I'm left to say is this hunch, this feeling I get in these spaces that there's, for one, for sure, much more going on than I could uh, describe or certainly explain,
Right.
way more happening all the time, including including what we might consider ghosts or spirits or something lingering. Because I know we're not just our bodies, that I know. So anyway, a long-winded answer to your question, but I wanted to contextualize my yes a little bit.
Yeah, you were working at Zen Hospice and you've been around other areas where a lot of people die. And have you ever
Yeah.
experienced anything like unexplainable or suspicious, like in a room after somebody died, or just seeing, or like, you said there is a feeling, like you said, but
Hmm.
it's hard to put into words. And I think people who are real definitive about this stuff are full of BS, to tell you the truth. I don't think
Yeah,
anybody really knows 100%.
exactly. Exactly. And
But
that's why I'm sorry to interrupt. That's why I think it's so important to contextualize these comments, these opinions or observations. Because I don't pretend to know, and I don't want the responsibility of having to pretend I know. I love medicine. I love knowing what's knowable, but I've come to make a lot of room for the things we just can't know. We just don't
yeah,
yet know, or something like that. So, right, I think that context is really, really important for all of us. Back to your question too, Patrick, being in the bedrooms and being around people who have just died or are dying, etc. I'm struck by there's on one level it's super profound and people taking their last breaths. I mean, what could be
sure.
more profound than that? And I've also witnessed too, like in just the course of work and in a place like Zen Hospice or a hospital that are devoted to this to some kind of care and where these things just happen, there's also this glorious sort of mundaneness that happens, an everydayness. Like when
Hmm.
I was, at Zen Hospice, people were dying every day and often in a very beautiful way. And it wasn't so separate or different from the rest of life. And so that's one point. A second point is, no, I never saw an apparition or something like that, or summoned anything or anybody. But what happens often, and more often as I pay attention, is something we might consider like synchronicity,
Hmm.
where I'll have a thought to reach out to someone, a patient of mine. I haven't thought about them for a while, and I'll have a thought, hey, I should reach out to George. I haven't talked to George. And I reach out to George, and sure enough, that's right when George needs something, or something's falling apart, or something just happened.
Hmm.
That happens again and again. And the more I pay attention to that sort of that connection that I can't see or prove, but that I can feel, that plays out almost in a near daily way. So that's my answer to your question. So no to actual ghosts or apparitions per se, but lots of vibes, lots of things that I can't explain.
Gotcha. So my next question, there's no right or wrong answer to this, but what do you think is easier for a family to get through the grieving process? Is it a sudden death where there was no time to prepare or say goodbye, usually like an accident or some kind of
Mhm,
trauma, or a lingering death where there
mhm.
is time for goodbyes? And, you know, people use the word closure. I don't know if that's a thing or not, if anybody's completely closed after a death. Y- You know,
Yeah,
I guess it's on a person by person basis, but
yeah.
which do you think is easier?
Well, yeah, I would say, I mean, you said it yourself too. It's really difficult to compare. I would just say each death comes with its own sort of package deal. I've never, if you're really, all deaths, include some amount of regret or second guessing or not knowing or wondering if I had gone this way, would it have been different? And so there's the same, like we were saying earlier, so the mundaneness of death in the same way that grief and a dying process of someone we love is a special moment. And it's also just another moment in these big lives. And these lives include wonderings and that sort of phenomenon of the grass is always greener. So I can't say for certain that whether sudden death or a more prolonged dying process is easier per se. But for some people with some relationships, I think that's probably the key takeaway, Patrick, is it
Mm,
sort of depends on the relationship of that person to the decedent. For some folks, it would have been just so hard to sit in that space. And some folks, if they're dying soon, it's sort of like just get it over with then. Like they just can't get in the mind that they're still living. And so they want to live so badly, but the fact that they can't means they want to die sooner just to get it over with. So there's just so many forces at work, both in the person who's dying and in the family members and loved ones around them, that make it impossible to make a blanket statement. So different strokes for different folks and different dynamics will make these situations easier or harder. And it's just a big old package deal. I
okay.
can also add, Patrick, that, for me, I think I bounce around on this question myself, just thinking about, as I try to make a habit of wondering what will I want? And I don't know. You asked me one day, I might say a sudden death sounds great. I'm just fully alive, and then just like the sky opens like a zipper and pluck, I'm out. Just like this
Right.
weird, almost surreal thing that can happen. Someone's here and then they're gone. Um, but I also have come to really appreciate the process of letting go, of being real and being very human with other people as you're falling apart, as you're coming down, as you're settling back into earth or death or whatever we want to call it. So I can make stories. I can tell you good stories around either way out.
Okay. Very good. Well, let's do a little vocabulary here. Could you explain the difference between palliative care, end of life care and hospice? You hear all that stuff and it gets clumped together quite a bit.
It does, Patrick, and I appreciate the question. It's really important for all of us to kind of get this right because a lot of us are suffering unnecessarily. We're with symptoms or all sorts of things that the people might be able out there who could help us. Let's take this space on. So
Okay.
hospice, hospice in a sense in the modern era came first, excuse me, and it came out of Europe and Great Britain specifically, the modern hospice movement. Hospice has been around for centuries and millennia as a sort of a often in part of a religious order, a sort of a place for the weary to come rest, or hospice is that word has meant many things over centuries. But in the 20th century, it was kind of picked up again by a woman named Dame Cicely Saunders in Great Britain, who herself was a nurse, social worker, and then a physician. She was sort of one woman a team. And in her experience, she watched how modern medicine just abandoned people who were beyond
Yeah.
repair. And how sad that was, and how unnecessary that was. So she devoted her career towards tending to folks who were dying soon, but were still here, and set about helping to kind of help people live until they actually died. A beautiful mission. And so she kind of got this all started in the 60s. Okay. And then her way of thinking reached the US in the late 70s and early 80s, people who trained with her, and hospice began in earnest in the US.
Hmm.
So it was that's sort of the origin of hospice. And basically it's interdisciplinary. So doctors, nurses, social workers, chaplains, volunteers, sometimes artists, art therapists, music therapists. The whole idea of hospice is to gather around someone and love them and help them feel as well as possible, tend to their family. The focus is on their suffering, not on the disease. All right. That's a novel statement within the world of healthcare. That's what makes it different. So that's hospice, and it's devoted since 1980s in the U.S. Ronnie Reagan signed the Medicare hospice benefit into law. So since 1982, hospice is an insurance designation. So when we say, "Oh, my buddy's on hospice," that means they are within 6 months or less to live,
Hmm.
and have focused all their efforts on their quality of life, and they have enrolled in hospice. Their insurance is now moved off of what it was, and it's now on hospice. So since the 80s, it's so I that word also points to an insurance designation. Okay, so that's hospice. It keeps going. Most of it is meted out in a person's home. 70+% of hospice care happens in the person's home. So there's a lot of details to say about it, but that's hospice. So when Medicare got in the business in the 80s and named the hospice benefit, they put two stipulations on it to sort of curb enrollment. So you could enroll in hospice if you had 6 months or less to live, according to the doctors, which is always a best guess. And then the second point is that you give up any intention of curing your illness, and all your efforts, all the money is now going towards your quality of life. So
Okay.
it's a real fork in the road that way. That's an insurance. That's not a philosophical point. That's an insurance designation. So
Okay.
those two limits are really important to keep in mind. I know I'm going on here a little bit, but I'm
That's
almost to
okay.
your almost to an answer. So because of those limitations, in the 80s, people were doing this work and it was so beautiful. And you'd have this experience like this loving team rallies around a person and sees them for what they are and bears witness and tends to their pain and loves their family. And it's so gorgeous. And then the feeling is like, well, why are we waiting to the final days of a person's life to provide this kind of comfort focused care? So that's when palliative care came into the mix. In the 90s, a bunch of doctors and nurses and others, but mostly the medical establishment said, we love this hospice thing, but how do we build this kind of care and get around that 6 months or less to live
Mm,
thing and the desire and the need to go on and give up any curative intent. So palliative care is the sort of younger, but now bigger cousin of hospice. And so it's the same interdisciplinary care, all devoted to your quality of life and helping you live well, but it doesn't require that you die in 6 months. So palliative care is very simply the interdisciplinary pursuit of quality of life in the context of serious illness. So it can happen anywhere from the time of diagnosis, anywhere along the way, you can get palliative care. But so now hospice is now a subset of palliative care. Hospice is relevant in the final months of life, whereas palliative care is relevant throughout the trajectory of illness. Does that make some sense, Patrick? That's a mouthful, but
it
there's a
does.
lot of
It does. And it's a relatively new thing here in the United States. You're talking about the
yes.
80s. I graduated from high school in 82.
Yeah,
So you think, it's like, okay, that's not that far away. So we've come a long way in a short amount of time.
that's right. It's really, thank you. I appreciate that perspective. Sometimes for those of us in the field, it feels like it's going agonizingly slow because the needs are so big, and with the aging
Sure.
population getting bigger, and healthcare is this behemoth. So we'd all like it to move faster. But to your point, Patrick, we've come very far very quickly. And the field is officially called hospice and palliative medicine. That's the medical subspecialty now.
Mm,
That was only designated in 2006. So this is all very new stuff.
very, and much needed. So I'm glad to see that. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
So
The big takeaway before we get off this question, I just
yeah.
want to hammer this point home, Patrick, is for folks who are interested in palliative care, you know, you qualify as long as you have a serious illness, and that can mean many different things. You can be expected to live for decades yet and still qualify for palliative care. The
Oh,
idea is
okay.
if you're sick and if you're dealing with serious illness, or someone in your family or friend group is, and they're suffering more than they need to, whether from symptoms or crappy communication or family dynamics are awry, or existentially they're lost for a sense of meaning in their life. Anyone suffering more than they need to within the context of illness, they are welcome. That's palliative care is for you.
Okay.
That's a really important piece. When you're finally in the terminal throes, then let's think about hospice, but that's way late in the game.
Gotcha. All right. So when is it time to stop treatment? And what do you do as a physician when a loved one pushes back against that? I mean, I'm sure you've had situations like
Mm.
in a hospice or a hospital situation where the end is, coming close. And sometimes the treatment is worse, than the cure, and why put this person through this agonizing, like say chemotherapy or radiation or whatever the case may be. And what, it's inevitable. The end is going to be coming very soon. But,
Yep.
and the person is still lucid and said, I'm done. That enough is enough. But what do
Mhm.
you do when you have like a loved one that is like, no, you know what? We got to keep fighting here.
Yeah.
How do you handle that?
Well, it's really hard. This is some of the hardest situations that come up in
I
my line
bet.
of work. Because it's often baked in love. It's often a family member who
Oh,
really just loves
absolutely.
this person so much. There is skullduggery and weird stuff that happens in families and, with inheritance on the line and things like that. Family dynamics can get really, as you know
Oh,
well,
yes. Yes, they can.
can erupt into all
Ooh.
sorts of,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
it can get ugly. It can get real ugly. But for the most part, what you're pointing to is just sort of a misapplication of a whole lot of love. So um, for that family member who just can't, who won't or can't accept that the patient themselves is ready to stop treatment, that the doctor is is suggesting that it's going to be more trouble than it's worth, that treatment, and the family member just won't hear it. Well, for one is to start like we just did. Hear what they're, don't follow the letter of their word. Hear where they're coming from. And usually where they're coming from is they're afraid to lose this person. They're either or in denial of some kind,
Sure.
or just so they just love this person so much they cannot fathom the idea of letting go. And it doesn't help that in our society we talk about stopping treatments as quitting or giving up.
Right. Yeah, we do.
Um, that's just the language we use, and we really got to be careful with this, Patrick, because we're sending each other signals that dying is a failure, that stopping treatment is somehow a weakness, and it's just not true. So part of the answer to your question is it's on all of us as society is to watch our messaging to each other. The truth
Mm.
is death is coming for all of us. It's in us. We are all wired to die. That's what living things
Absolutely.
do. So trying to find a way to holding this reality with our eyes wide open, with a loving embrace, but clarity, is really, really key. So back to your question, keeping all that in mind, you want to hold that person who, that family member who just can't hear this treatment plan or stopping treatment. First order of business is to hear them out. Let their voice matters too. They probably just need to be heard, and love them as best you can. Hold that and see in their fear, see that love. And then eventually, if you have enough time and trust between you, you can gently point out, like, okay, I hear you. And and the truth is that I, as a physician, I'm afraid that more treatment's actually going to hasten their death. And even if it doesn't make their death come sooner, it's very likely to cause a lot of suffering. And the last thing I want to do is cause your mom, dad,
Right.
XYZ, any harm. I do not want to cause suffering. And I'm afraid more treatment's actually going to cause suffering. Usually, when you recast the question that way, that can really break through a family member because no
Mm.
one wants to cause suffering. So that's a beginning into your question. That's usually how we approach that situation. There's other variations on that theme. All sorts of other things happen. But am I
Right.
making sense so far, Patrick? Can you
Oh,
kind of picture that?
absolutely. Absolutely. And like what you said, I mean, different people react different ways. There's denial, there's, extreme grief, they just
Yeah.
don't want to let go. I get that. I mean, I remember I
Yeah.
had a friend who was dying of cancer and he was relatively young. I don't even know if he was 50. And it was towards the end. He was in the hospital and the hospital was going to kick him out because his wife kept on bringing in these like health smoothies that she was convinced
Uh-huh.
would cure him. And he was so far along.
Yeah.
He didn't even look like himself. I mean, if I saw him on the street, I would have no idea it was him. It was
Yeah.
horrible. But it
Yeah.
got to the point where it became a big issue between the hospital and the doctor's like, I can't have you doing this.
Hmm.
It,
Yeah.
it turned into a thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you know how did they, was there ultimately some resolution? Did
There
something get
was,
communicated?
they communicated very well, and he wound up in hospice, and he only lasted like 1 or 2 days in hospice.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
declined very, very quickly after a certain point, and then
Yeah.
all of it was moot point. Then who cares?
Yeah.
It's done and over with.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that was a toughie. Yeah.
It is a toughie, and that sometimes just happens, even with great communication and patience and all sorts of emotional attunement and loving. Death is not easy, and sometimes it's just gotta hurt, and we're
Yep.
gonna. So I want to disabuse the listeners that if we only communicate well and if we just keep our eyes wide open, then we can all have this very peaceful death, and it'll be so meaningful, and we'll all be humming and hugging and crying, and everything's gonna. That's just not how it always. That just doesn't. It doesn't always go that way,
No,
and
it does
that's
not.
not. I just want to be clear, like for all the talk here that we can work on this and we can have better deaths for ourselves and we can live differently so we have fewer regrets. I wholeheartedly believe in all of that. And I also believe it is also true that no matter how much work we do, life is just hard, unfathomably hard sometimes, and sad as hell. And sometimes we cause pain by trying to avoid it. And one way and another, our deaths are going to be what they're going to be. And it's not a failure if not everyone's singing Kumbaya at the end. I don't want to set us up to have to perform into our deaths. That
Right.
would be wrong.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. So, a little bit of a personal question for you. Has your belief in a higher power, religion changed from the time that you started work and end of life or hospice to where you
Mhm.
are right now?
Yes and no. I was raised Episcopalian, and I tried Christianity on very seriously as a younger person. Ultimately, lost sight of the church per se, but have, I would call myself agnostic if I had to delineate.
Hmm.
I have made something of a religion of, like we've already said a little bit, of not knowing. Life is mysterious to me. There's all sorts of things I don't get to understand. And so into that space creeps a kind of a faith. And for me, that faith is that we are connected, like we've talked. I know, I believe in my bones that we are connected in ways we can't prove or can't see. And that there are forces at work that I don't understand. And for me, that's become enough. It used to bother me that I didn't have more certainty,
Yeah.
but my religion now is this agnostic thing. I get to hold that as a glorious mystery of which I am part, but I don't pretend to know. So that's this kind of a statement of my spiritual kind of place. And to your question, over time, that's where I had arrived there before I became a hospice and palliative medicine physician. But I would say doing this work has furthered that sort of commitment to not pretending to know things I don't know and delighting in the mystery of things. And the more I see, the more I'm around people and experiencing that sort of synchronicity and simultaneity and all sorts of things that I just sort of just wild to me, what feel like maybe coincidences, who knows? I'm just more and more attuned and more delighted by and giddy at those kinds of that kind of mysterious connection.
Mm.
So if anything, my belief systems haven't changed. I've just become perhaps a little more playful with it.
Okay. Also, after your accident, did you
Mhm.
hate a higher power or were you like, oh, thank God I'm alive? I mean,
You
if you
know,
want to talk about, what happened to
yeah.
you.
Oh, I'm happy to, Patrick. Just for your listeners, real quick. So when I was 19, I was sophomore in college, and I was out east, and I was screwing around with my buddies on top of a commuter train, and the wires run overhead, and I had jumped up on. It was a park train. We didn't think it was that crazy. Anyway, I jumped up on top of the train, climbed the ladder, and when I stood up, I had a metal watch on my left wrist, and the electricity arced from the power line to my watch. And so I ended up near death for about 6 weeks and ended up losing both legs below the knee and my left arm below the elbow. So big old brush with death. Big old what I call the cosmic spanking. This thing just came around and just whacked me in the head and said, "Oh, you're not in control here, boy."
No.
And I took the message, I took the memo, so it really, it was an enormous event in my life, obviously. And it's at the source for so many things I've done since, including my interest in medicine and all things life and death, like we're talking. So that's a little bit of my origin story. So now what now, Patrick? I forgot your question.
No, I was just wondering if you were, as far as like faith goes, you went through something like that, and I think it could go either way. Either, like, why do
Oh
you hate
yeah,
me so much, God, for doing this to
yeah,
me? Or holy shit, thank God
yeah.
I'm alive right now. I shouldn't be alive.
Yes, it was, it was so probably it was a little more of the latter, and probably a third thing, which is I had seen enough by that age. I was kind of a sensitive kid. And I knew enough. I lived, by a lot of counts, in suburban, mostly Chicago area, nuclear family, parents intact. I had a really good, fortunate life by a lot of measures. And I was still aware that even despite all my good fortune, I suffered plenty even before my accident,
Hmm.
existentially. Like, what's the
Okay.
meaning of, you know? And I grew up around a mother who had polio and was disabled herself. So I had already
Hmm.
asked myself a lot of these questions about I'd asked God a lot of these kinds of questions like, does my mom, is she a bad person? Did she deserve to be disabled? Because I
Right.
mean, so that didn't make any sense to me. So
Yep.
my point is I knew enough to not hate myself because something bad happened to me. I
Hmm.
knew bad things happen to good people, quote unquote, all the time. So it was not, I got to sidestep the sort of why me questions for the most part. It was much more actually like, why not me? Almost sometimes like finally something obviously hard happened to me because otherwise I appeared way too lucky. So in
Yeah.
some ways, my outer life now matched my inner life. In some ways, there was a relief to it, if I'm honest. Not to fetishize, I wish this hadn't happened. It hurt like hell. But on that existential spiritual level, my response was really more like, yeah, this stuff happens. I'm glad it happened to me. It's in some ways easier that it happened to me than my friends. And I was in a weird way, grateful and very grateful to still be alive.
How long were you in the hospital after that accident?
I was in the burn unit for about 2 months or so, and then a step down unit in that same hospital out in New Jersey for another few weeks, and then back to Chicago for rehab for about another 2 or 3 months, and then out to outpatient.
Oh my
So
God.
altogether in the hospital, one way or another, for about 5 or 6 months.
So to understand exactly what happened, you can visualize it, but the electricity went through your wrist or your hand and literally burned you from the inside out.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Now, I'm amazed it didn't like toast any like major organs.
I agree. I can't fathom how it didn't. I mean, it's a wild thought to have all that heat flowing inside you, burning from the inside out, like you say. And I had road crew at the time. I was in probably the best shape of my life, which certainly helped me survive.
Oh yeah.
No two ways about it. But to your point, it touched every cell in my body, not just the stuff that got amputated. So I'm very curious about how I'll age, what sort of whether that weathered my heart and my kidneys and my liver, et cetera, sort of prematurely aged my organs or not. I don't know. And there's not enough data around surviving electrical injuries to tell us. So
Yeah.
I'm both amazed that my body still works at all and wondering where I'll be as I get a little older, how I'll age.
But you know what? You look great. I mean, if I didn't know your story beforehand, I mean, how old are you?
53.
Yeah, I mean, you you look fine to me.
Yeah, thank you, buddy. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I feel pretty dang good, really, all things considered. I'm getting that age where, my blood pressure's up, my prostate's huge, all that good
Yeah,
stuff.
that's old guy
So
stuff.
I'm
I'm with you there, brother.
yeah, exactly. I mean, like it's normal. So it's part of being in these bodies. This is what they do. So, but
That's
so
right.
far, so good. All things
Okay.
considered, really.
All right. Have you ever heard patients talk of visions or conversations with dead relatives? And I'll explain
Yes.
why I asked this in a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I can answer this one uncharacteristically so far today quickly. I mean, the answer is yes. Uh, in medicine, in the medical worldview, we tend to label this delirium or hallucinations or delirium, and sometimes we'll medicate that delirium. We suppose it to be an uncomfortable thing that this person's living in some unreality. But I'll quickly add, as I've gotten more and more into this work, like we've been talking, I'm more and more invested in the mystery of things. And I have come to see that what we pathologize as delirium might actually be something really important happening for that person. And I'm not in a position to judge, from the outside, it looks just like looks like a non-reality, but who am I to say? So sometimes we medicate this kind of delirium and sometimes we let it roll. But answer to your question is yes, I see it. It's a common phenomenon at the end of life.
Yeah, it's interesting because James Altucher had Sebastian Younger on his show recently, and he just wrote
Mhm.
a book called My Time of Dying: How I Came Face to Face with the Idea of an Afterlife.
Mhm.
And it's interesting because Sebastian, great author. I mean, he wrote Tribe. He's written a bunch of great stuff. He was a war reporter,
Uh-huh.
and he is, as he puts it, a devout atheist. And his one of the arteries in his pancreas, like, aneurysed. He had an aneurysm. He was an
Uh-huh.
hour away from a hospital, so he was bleeding out inside his belly. So
Mm.
he literally died. He bled out. They put a line in his jugular to just infuse him with as much blood as possible. But he talks about this on the podcast where there was a black void that opened up next to him, and then his
Mhm.
father appeared to him, and he can't explain in words what his father looked like, or anything. Like, he wasn't wearing like a three-piece suit, or he didn't have wings or anything like that, but he knew it was his dad, and he's like, is this my time?
Mm.
And then before, and he knew that the doctors were working on him, trying to save his life at the same time, and he knew this void was like crossing over into another, either dimension, hopefully not hell, maybe heaven, who knows. I haven't been there, but this is a very well-educated man who, is very devout in his there is no God, there is no afterlife, etc. And now all of a sudden this happens to him personally, and it slaps him in the face. And
Yeah.
what really stood out to me was, okay, you see your father, okay, who's dead, by the way. His father's been dead for years.
Mhm.
And, again, the delirium, all these chemicals, are doing all kinds
Yeah.
of crazy stuff in your brain when you're getting that close to death. But he
Yeah.
said, what can't be explained is, why are all these different people, geographically thousands and thousands of miles away from each other, having the same delirium? How can
Yeah.
you explain it?
Well, spoiler alert, you can't. No one can.
Right.
So we're left with this observation that right, there's a remarkable consistency in these near-death experiences. That can't be, you can't just gloss over that fact. So I don't know if I haven't read that book. I don't know if he then goes on to posit what he thinks was actually happening. You might say, DMT, is a tryptamine is a hallucinogen that we all make, and maybe towards at the very end we release a little DMT, and that's what causes our hallucinations, etc. So you might find someone who gives you sort of a mechanical explanation of molecularly what's happening there. But even if that's true, and we don't have proof of that even, but even if say that we have a chemical pathway to describe this series of visions, you still don't know what's behind, what's behind the mechanism of those chemicals, what's pushing them, what they're pointing to, etc. And to this larger point, the consistency in these phenomena is so telling across time and space that I'm left with, I have to believe that these are real experiences on some level, and just get really comfortable with the fact that I can't explain it. That makes a lot of doctors and scientists and some lay people really uncomfortable, but that's why so much of my conversation here, so much of my own thinking around this stuff is getting very comfortable with things we just don't get to understand.
Yeah, and you know what? For some people who, have devoted their lives to higher education or whatever, I think it's almost a kick in the ego a little bit. It's like,
Yeah.
I should know this. It's like I have all the answers. Oops, no, I don't have all the answers.
You don't. Yeah, well, get over yourself. If you've managed to find your way to adulthood and think that you should have all the answers, you're missing some notes there, buddy.
Yeah. I mean,
So,
like, personally, I was dead when I was 12, 13 years old. Our house was filled with carbon monoxide. our whole family got carbon monoxide
Oh,
poisoning.
wow.
And as a last ditch effort, this is back and you had one phone in the house and it was in the kitchen or wherever it was hanging on the wall. And I'm low crawling. I couldn't stand.
Mm,
All I knew was something was very wrong.
mm,
And
mm.
my dad got up, he made it to the kitchen and he passed out, hit the stove, sent the stove flying, almost broke his collarbone. And my
Oof.
mom was the last one conscious. My brother was knocked out cold. I was well on my way, and my dad was unconscious. And we didn't know what
Oh,
was going on.
good. Oh, man.
And I'm yelling to my mom. I'm like, Mom, 911, 911. And she's just like, what'll the neighbors think? She's this little Irish woman's like, oh, me calling the fire department. I'm like, Mom, this is serious, Mom. And she's like, oh, the neighbors will laugh at us. And I'm like, oh, I'm wearing my nightgown. And I'm like, Ma, they're firefighters. They've seen all this shit before. Don't worry about it, Ma. So my last memory before I passed out was we had a record player and I was under the record player, my head was, and the family dog was looking at me and I was looking at the dog, and it was just an overwhelming sense of happiness and peace. It was like a relief.
Hmm.
And the next memory, I'm in a snowbank in front of our house with a paramedic working on me. And I'm in my PJs and I'm like, holy shit, it's cold out here. This is Chicago in December. I'm not liking this.
Oh, buddy boy.
But I
Wow.
did not see anything. I didn't experience. All it was just that intense feeling of peace. And I was like,
Yeah.
ah. And then, one more, my brother, he died about a year and a half ago. They found him in a snowbank, more snow stories. He was pulseless non-breathing.
Hmm.
And they did the CPR machine on him. He was in a coma for 3 days. They gave him the last
Hmm.
rites, and the doc is like, he might come out of it, he may not. We need to start talking about stuff. And I'm like, okay, cool. I get a phone call. I leave the hospital, and it's like, yeah, he was intubated, and he pulled the tube out, and he's like going banana cakes. And I'm like, oh, okay. So later on, I'm talking to him. I said, so any angels playing violins? Were you up in a cloud somewhere? And he says, complete darkness. I don't even remember like getting to that point.
Hmm. Yeah.
But then you talk to other people, and it's completely different.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Well, did I just cut you off, Patrick? Were you about to say something
no, no,
more?
no. Go ahead, please.
Oh, well, I wonder, yeah, I wonder, it's also true, like what may have happened to your brother there, and all the meds he would have been on too, that perhaps interfered with any memory he might have had.
True.
But I do not remember any around the first moments of my injury where I was really particularly touch and go. I don't have any memory of that either. But it's more like I have a feeling.
Okay.
It's a felt sense. I do remember early on in my time in the burn unit, I, I've talked about this before, the snowball moment where someone smuggled a snowball into the burn unit.
Oh yeah, I love the story. That's a great story.
Yeah, I mean, burn units are incredibly unnatural environments. Every infection is what kills people from
Right.
burns, generally speaking. Everything is hyper sterilized. Everyone's masked and gowned. Only, very few people are allowed in. It's a hyper controlled environment. And they snuck this snowball in. I didn't even, you had no sense of day or light or whatever is going on for months. And I just remember the feeling of holding the snowball and watching it melt in my hand and feeling the coldness of it. And it was matching my own experience of me kind of disintegrating as I knew myself, dying in a way, falling apart in
Yeah.
another way. Just I was disintegrating by some angle, but from another angle, I was just becoming something else. I was just, it was just also clear, like this, a transfer of energy that yes, this body dies, but that energy goes somewhere. We know that. That we can observe. That is actually science. So I just remember touching into that place where it didn't matter whether I lived or died was almost immaterial.
Hmm.
Either way, I was still part of this crazy, wild, conscious unfolding of a universe that I can't explain. But in life, I belonged in it, and in death, I belonged in it. In a way, you can't escape this living mass, this swirling life death this ball that we all are part of. I get so all I'm saying here is to your points, to your own experience, your brother's experience, there's a range, but there's also a consistency. I don't remember that I've ever heard anyone come back from a near-death experience terrified. Maybe they're out there, I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's back to I can't explain it all, but I have this basic felt sense that it's all okay. All, including our troubles, are real, but even those are okay. The imperfections of the world are part of the deal. That's okay too. It's all okay. And I can't prove that. It's just a felt residue that I have from my own coming close to death and those of others around me. And I don't know, you've come close yourself. Does that residue stick with you?
I've been around death a lot,
Yeah.
being a cop and being in the field and, a lot of, mostly shooting victims or, maybe a car accident here and there, but mostly, either a stabbing or a shooting kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I've
Yeah.
watched people take their last breaths because as a police officer, you're trying to get a dying declaration.
Yeah.
It's like you ask the paramedic is like, how is this looking? They're like, not very good.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, who killed you? Which is odd to be asking that,
Yeah.
and it's like, and you have to let them know it's like, there's a very, very good chance you're not going to make it. So
Yeah.
you need to help us help, bring this person to justice that just is pretty much killed you. And
Yeah.
I've had different reactions. I've had F you, and I had one guy say
Hmm.
Scooby Doo. I'll never look at Scooby Doo the same ever again. It was the name of a gangster. He was one of the big drug dealers in the area. So he was Scooby. So we were
Wow.
looking for Scooby all day after this poor guy died.
Wow.
And I'm like,
Wow.
okay, well,
Wow.
but yeah, I think
Wow.
there's, yes, I to what you asked me, absolutely. Because
Yeah.
I've had bullets whiz by my head by a couple of feet, and I've been in situations
Mhm.
where I'm like, I shouldn't be alive right now. I've been in car accidents. I've done all kinds of crazy stuff. And
Mhm.
but being
Mhm.
clinically like dead and then being alive again, you're just kind of like, okay, I was just happy to be alive again. And I was mad because I was really
Exactly.
cold.
Yeah, right on. Back to sort of basic feelings, right? I mean, it's a
Yeah,
profound and a mundane experience. Again, yeah,
yeah,
you still left with this body. It still gets cold. It still hurts. And I want to just let's honor the context that you've experienced so much death around, in the context of justice, or rather injustice, much of the time.
right.
So I don't want to be cavalier with our philosophical and spiritual points of view around death in general. But it really matters how we get to our death. I often think about this, and like for example, like if I lost my house to a forest fire, you know, that would suck. I would be very sad, you
Yes,
know. That would be really a bummer, and I'd be upset. But how different would that be than if I lost my house to an arsonist, to a
yes,
fellow human being who on purpose caused me harm? Either way, I'm without a house. Either way, death happens either way. But the ways we get there changes so much of the experience and the feelings we have along the way. So I don't want my kumbaya stuff to be confused with everything's just so great. No, everything can be horrible. But that horribleness is also part of this deal called life. And in the end, this life thing is pretty amazing. And
absolutely.
to not, I don't want to belittle the terrible stuff that happens. And yet life remains amazing. That's my point.
Right. I'm interested in what your view on assisted suicide is. Mainly, you know, the assisted, dying that Dr. Kevorkian, back in the day was,
Yeah.
so controversial, back then. In theory, I think it's a good thing, but I could
Hmm.
see where, there would be religious pushback or abuse in certain situations. It's like, who are you to play God?
Yeah. It's a great question. And it's really rich stuff for conversation. I think we all should all be talking about stuff like this more. So thank you for doing it here, Patrick. So for your listeners, Kevorkian was around in the 80s, I believe.
I
Um,
think so, yeah.
Yeah, and he was helping people with, he invented a machine. He was a pathologist, not a clinical physician, but he was a pathologist. And he helped people die by actively euthanizing them, essentially, for people who wanted to die. Um, and he was tried and convicted, and that was the way he went about it was very problematic. He was sort of doing something very important, but I think he was sort of the wrong messenger. If I had to put a sort of a statement, a pithy statement to Kevorkian per se, but that's just history. That situation and other sort of ethical quandaries of people who ended up in comas on life support for years on end, and ethical and legal arguments whether it was okay to withdraw treatment if someone was not going to wake up again, etc. These questions have been rattling around bioethics for decades.
Sure.
In 1997, the Supreme Court weighed in whether or not we have a right to hasten our own deaths. The Supreme Court concluded that we do not have a constitutional right and kicked it back to the states to decide. And that's when Oregon went on became the first state with a death with dignity law that basically says that if you have a terminal illness, and you're within 6 or so months to live, essentially if you're hospice eligible, like we are talking about
Okay. Sure.
how to get into hospice, if you meet the criteria to get into hospice, generally speaking, you'd meet the criteria to hasten your own death legally. So now, since Oregon's experiment, there are, I think, 10 or 11 states that have a version of this law on their own books. So in California, since 2016, it's legal to hasten your own death within the context of terminal illness. So that has felt importantly different from the impulse of suicide. So we've stopped using the language of physician-assisted suicide and instead talk about medical aid in dying. So
Okay.
that's just the term of art you'll hear now. But language, how language is,
Sure.
it's malleable. But what I think we're trying to get away from is the baggage of suicide that is, one, illegal, two, considered to be a failing morally, etc., by many people, pathological in nature. There's a lot of baggage that comes with suicide. Whereas if someone's dying soon, either way, and if they want to participate and name the date of their death, for whatever reason, that can be an actually constructive, healthy, beautiful thing. That seems importantly different from suicide. So that's a big overview of where we stand legally and ethically in this country. And it's still controversial. The Catholic Church is pretty absolutist about this, for example.
Absolutely.
It is playing God. God is the only one who gives life or takes it away, period, end of story. There is no space for something like this. There is, however, within Catholicism on it, there is a place for you can ethically and legally and in confidence within religious law, you can withdraw care. You can get out of the way of death coming. So there are all sorts of distinctions in here that get very
Mm.
interesting. But we don't have 10 hours to discuss it all. I'll
Right.
just say, besides that sort of overview, that's where we are sort of societally now. My own take is I ultimately am glad these laws exist. I'm grateful for these laws. I've seen a lot of people suffer way more than they need to just to avoid the semblance of that they were giving up, just so that they could say that they kept trying, but were causing themselves a ton of harm and would have really preferred to end their suffering at somewhere along the way. And before the law came into being, I wish I had had that power to help them. So I'm glad this law exists and at the individual level. But as you scroll out to the layer of us as a social or as a legal framework, it gets tricky. For example, Patrick, you know, if the reason that legally we sanction someone wanting to end their life sooner than they otherwise would die, if basically the reason we say that we bless is essentially that your suffering is intractable and that living longer is actually harder than dying, if you're suffering enough, as a last resort, we'll bless you wanting to die. We'll give you the medication so you can hasten your own death. Well, okay, I get that. But if we're not doing everything in society that we already know helps each other suffer less, if we're not actually doing all we can do to help that person not suffer so much, you know, I struggle to say that we should be making it easier for people to get off the planet when we're not we're not doing the things that we know help us live while we're actually alive. If everyone in this country had access to good palliative care, someone tending to their suffering, someone loving them, if we work through all the systems issue in healthcare that get in the way of people getting good care, if we did all those things and the person still wanted to die, then I'd feel a lot better about it. But so I get for me, the ethical quandary is how do we bless a law like this
Right.
while at the same time not doing more that we already know how to do to help people, to help each other want to live another day.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. All right. In Game on Netflix. I highly, highly recommend this documentary. I watched it when I was thinking about or attempting to get you on the show. I'm like, well, I got to see this show, and it was touching.
Mhm.
I really, really enjoyed it. And
Great.
one part that really stood out to me, there's more than one, but one that really stood out to me was I believe her name was Mirtha or
Uh,
Maratha. Her,
mhm.
her doctor was coming in to say goodbye because he was leaving, Zen Hospice.
Mhm.
And he got down on her level. He like sat down. He didn't, a lot of times doctors will just stand there and they're
Yeah.
kind of aloof, like the proximity to the patient, they're kind of like on the other side of the room almost sometimes,
Yeah.
but he was tearing up as he's saying goodbye to this woman that he knows is going to, die very soon. And,
Yeah.
he's not going to be there. And I thought to myself, well, first of all, that's a different way of approaching, you know, medicine. Like I said before,
Yeah.
most of the time doctors, you know, they don't get that up close and personal with you for that kind of situation. And
Yeah.
secondly, I'm thinking to myself, a lot of times they don't get emotionally invested because that's their self-defense.
Mhm.
That's their, it's like, I can't get all broken up about every person that's going to die because tomorrow might be three or four more or five or who knows how many. And I'm going to become
Yeah.
a puddle of goo. So
Yeah.
help me understand that.
Yeah. Yeah. You really, it's a great question, Patrick. You know, each of us gets to say, I mean, life, I'm all I think denial, for example, is a very powerful, useful force to a point. There's the truth of existence, us on this one planet floating around this one sun and a zillion galaxies. I mean, the whole craziness of if you really open your aperture and take in a full expanse of what it means to be alive, it's pretty crazy. It's pretty
It is.
wild. And the things that any of us do, we impose order and structure and systems and culture to help us make life a little bit more knowable, a little bit more predictable, a little bit more tolerable. But don't confuse all those conventions with the actual reality. The reality is, as you've seen it, as I've seen it, if you pay attention, the reality is way weirder, way bigger, way harder, way more beautiful, way wilder. So
Right.
I say all that to say that's the truth from where I sit, and I take nothing for whatever you need to do or I need to do to stay in this thing called life and to work our way through our day. Um, in denial included. Okay, I get that it's hard to take in the full view of reality every moment of every day. I just need to say that it's important that we also acknowledge conventions that we're protecting ourselves like you said, that doctor who doesn't get close to their patient, the doctor who doesn't sit down next to the bed, who maintains distance. um, on some level I understand that that's what that person needs to do to protect themselves, and I don't ever want to take that away. Whatever someone needs to do to protect themselves and stay safe, that's okay by me to a point. And I have witnessed in myself and others that that method of staying detached and aloof and unconnected ultimately bites us in the ass because you cut out because that all that connection is where the good stuff is too. It's where the
Mhm.
juice is. It's where the meaning and the power and potency of all this hard work we're doing comes through you know so if we're trying to protect ourselves from the pain, I've yet to see a filtration system that keeps out just the hard stuff, but lets all the good stuff flow.
Right.
So if you're not careful, you scar down, you detach, you're gonna just gonna numb out. And as I was saying earlier with the snowball, when I realized the purpose of my existence is not comfort. If I were just pursuing comfort and tried to keep all the sadness and hard stuff out, it would be a partial life. It's just part of the deal that all this pain happens. And so I'd much rather us as a society, I'd much rather the culture of medicine teach to this idea that that we are connected. You and I are connected. I'm connected to my patients. Whether I choose to see it or work from it is up to me. But that is the truth. And so I'd much rather spend time teaching each other, being with each other, learning to let each other cry if that's what we need to do, and then move on. In other words, keeping the tears at bay as a means to keeping moving on, again, I think ultimately is a short-term goal that has long-term suffering and consequence that I'd much rather we get better at crying than preventing the tears. And so that's what that doctor, you'll meet a lot of palliative care doctors who dare to sit at the bedside and not walk away and will dare to shed a tear. Because I will tell you, not only is it ultimately, I think, good for that doctor, ultimately in the long run, but it is one of the most beautiful things that we can do for our patients is to emote and express my own sorrow that this person's going to die. For the dying person, that's a very beautiful gift. So that's my response to that.
Yeah, I thought it was neat. It's not something you see a whole lot of. So that
Yeah,
kind of caught me off guard a little bit. And I'm just like, well,
yeah,
bravo, good for him.
yeah.
Good for
Be
him.
real. A dying
Yes.
person, what's so hard is when someone's, gaslighting or pretending this isn't happening. The dying person knows it's happening. And if the world is
Yeah.
treating them like there's nothing wrong, it's like it's a kind of a cruelty. You're not acknowledging that person's reality. And that is a very base kind of there's a cruelty to that. There can be. So
Gotcha. Now, kind
yeah,
of along the same vein, have you ever attended a funeral for a patient? Patient's funeral?
I have. Yes, I have several. I gotta tell you, it was very awkward. It was very weird for me. I didn't really know my place. Friend,
Right.
doctor. Yeah, it was weird. But so the answer your question is yes, and I have felt weird about it.
Interesting. See, I asked my general practitioner, I interviewed him on my podcast because he
Uh-huh.
had a lot of patients that were first responders, and I wanted to pick his brain for a while. And I asked him the same question, and he says yes. And he said he had a patient that threw her own funeral before she passed away. She had a terminal
Yeah.
illness, and she's like,
Yep.
I want to be around the people that I like. So she
Yeah.
said, I'm just inviting the people that I like. I know there's going to be people come to my funeral because they have to, or they feel like they have to, or whatever the case. She said, and he went to her funeral before she died. And he said it was one of the coolest
Mhm.
things he's ever done.
Yeah. Yeah. So awesome. I mean, yeah. I mean, so yes, I've been to a few funerals in the conventional sense. I have felt it's a sort of a tangent. It was a little weird. I think people wanted me to speak. I wasn't sure of my place. That's sort of a separate point. I was glad
Yeah.
to be at the funeral. Very glad to be invited. But I've also been at these sort of living memorials where people throw themselves a party because, why don't you kind of want to be there to hear
Yeah,
everyone say nice things
absolutely.
and
Yes.
so I love this notion. It's a good example of when we finally allow ourselves to turn our attention to this complete reality that includes our own death, that includes tears, includes all sorts of stuff. Well, then we can kind of get in there and play with it. So I love when I hear people sort of taking matters into their own hands with the nature of their burial. Like more and more people are opting for green burial, where you just put me in
Mm.
the ground, not cased in lead, and just let me go back to nature. Things like that. I love hearing these stories. Home funerals, because they're make people what is happening there is people are making they're inhabiting their own death. They're linking life and death, which I think is a very healthy thing to be doing. So overall, I love that idea, and I love when people throw themselves parties, and I've been to those, and that's a wild feeling in the air, but they've been a beautiful every time I've probably been to three that I can remember. And they were all gorgeous, awkward, but life's awkward too. There's
Right.
it's weird and awesome all at the same time.
It's funny because, I was brought up a strict, Irish Catholic, because mom and
Mhm.
dad are from Ireland, it's like, and, lately, I was like, yeah, I want to be cremated and I want, I didn't tell my mom this, but yeah, I said, I want my ashes in the ocean. And I told my kids, I said, what would be really cool is blow my ashes out of a cannon in a
Hmm.
pirate ship. And I want everybody in attendance wearing pirate costumes and they have to speak like pirates. If you're wearing a costume and you're trying to talk like a pirate, there ain't going to be a whole lot of crying going on. Yeah, there might be some, but I think it'll be more laughing than anything else. So I thought, let's give that a try.
That'd be hilarious. And
Yeah.
again, I love hearing that. Like getting creative with the things that we can't control or can't change. That's a deeply human, wonderful, wonderful response, if you ask
Yeah.
me.
So, any unusual requests for, by people like the towards the end there, like a dying request or something like that? Anything that sticks out in your head?
Um, no, I mean they're no, by the time oftentimes when someone is in palliative care because all this attention and time, oftentimes by the time the death rolls around, there's not much more to be done, you
Okay.
know. But there's been sweet, like some dying requests at Zen Hospice. People wanted, for various reasons, wanted to be rest in state and stay in the bed. Family members wanted them to stay there for a day or two or even three after the death.
Oh
You
wow.
have to
Okay.
pack the body in dry ice and things
Yeah, I was
like
just gonna
that.
say, yeah,
Yeah.
the body
I mean,
decomposes
so
quick.
it does. And so
Yeah.
if you're going to lie in state for a while, you need a bunch of ice. Okay. But that's just an example. But,
Yeah.
well, there have been various requests that you can imagine. Some folks have wanted a last cigarette or wanted me to pass on a message or something like that. But nothing that I ever had a problem doing and nothing that struck me as deeply problematic.
Okay. Now, one thing that my ex-wife's grandpa, who I love to death, we got along swimmingly. He had a
Mm.
massive heart attack and he had all kinds of health issues. So there was debate on what are we going to do with grandpa. And he wasn't that old. He was like maybe in his late 60s, early 70s.
Mhm.
And out of nowhere, these doctors and nurses come in. They're like, we're the end of life team. I'm like, I
Mm.
didn't know there was such a thing. They're like, okay. And they were talking about giving him antidepressant, anti-anxiety meds. And I'm like, that makes a ton of sense. I never heard of that until then. Is that pretty common?
Well, I wonder, end of life team. I've not heard. Was he in a hospital?
Yes, he was in hospital.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. That may have been, I wonder. My guess is it was actually the hospital's palliative care team, and maybe they just refer to themselves. And some
Okay.
teams really do focus on death. I'm not sure. I've not heard that. That is not much of, that's not a real term of art, the end of life team.
Okay.
Um, but notwithstanding what they were, but that aside, the idea of offering antidepressants or anxiolytics, what we can call them, anti-anxiety meds, um, you know, that starts to make a lot of sense once you've traversed the desert of seeing death, seeing dying as part of living, as a lived experience, and as soon as you've gotten around to every moment is precious and every moment matters. So even if I'm dying in a week, you might say, oh, well, why bother with anything? I'm gonna be gone in a week. Well, you might also say, I'm gonna be gone in a week. Every moment really
Oh,
matters. So
absolutely.
how I feel extra matters. So then all of a sudden, treating depression or anxiety or pain become all of a sudden really, really smart. If you can eke out, if the guy's got, 7 minutes left, and then six of them can be free of anxiety, well, that sounds like a good deal to me. So again, I think the magic here is seeing death and dying as part of life, as a lived experience. And if the goal is really to really live life and even love life until the moment we're gone, well, then that move makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I was surprised but relieved with it because he was having,
Yeah.
a lot of problems. I went in the room, he says, Patrick, he said, give me a knife. I want to slash my fucking wrists. And I'm like,
Mm.
I never heard him swear like that before. And he
Mhm.
was just, and I'm like, okay. And I'm like, obviously I'm not going to give him a knife, but I tried talking to him, etc. And when the doctor said that, I'm like, oh my God, that makes 100%, sense to me. I'm glad
Yeah.
that's even being offered. So
Yeah.
that was
Good. And
great.
may I ask, did he get the benefits of some of those meds? Did he?
Yes, he did. He did. He calmed
Oh,
down
good.
quite a bit, and they moved him to a different section of the hospital, and they're setting up hospice. And he died before he even went into hospice. His heart
Yeah.
just gave out.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, that was good. And his son was by his bedside as he died. So I
Well,
mean, we all took turns, that kind of thing. So that was great.
good.
Um, when
Good.
you were practicing
Uh-huh.
regular medicine, or even now, what's your
Mhm.
self-talk when you're heading in to deliver bad news to a family or even a patient?
Hmm. That's a great question,
What are you saying
Tim.
to yourself when you're walking down that long hall? You're just like, oh God.
Yeah. Well, I think one way or another, what I'm saying to myself is, these are not conversations you're dying to have. They're
Right.
inherently hard conversations. To your point, you're about to go tell someone something that's going to really hurt. And so I just want to acknowledge the wisdom of your question. This is not easy, and this gets at why medicine doesn't have these conversations very well. Doctors aren't trained to do this well, and so they half truth it. It's hard to get a real honest answer from doctors. It's hard to talk to them about emotionally laden stuff for this reason, because it's hard.
Right.
So let's acknowledge that. Now, what I find myself as I walk in those conversations, one of probably the biggest answer to your question, Patrick, is I remind myself again and again that this is happening whether this is happening whether or not I do anything. It's, in other words, it's not on me. I'm delivering news that I didn't create. And if I don't say these words, it doesn't mean it's not happening. So
Right.
I get my health set in this mindset, like that depersonalizes my place in it. So it's not all on me. This is the guy's life or death isn't hanging in the balance of me. So I kind of talk myself into being, basically into showing up at all, that I have something to offer by delivering this truth kindly. That's what I can offer is kindness, and I can offer the courage of walking in and saying this stuff to you, because you, my friend, have the harder part of having to receive this stuff. And so that gets me in a place of compassion for myself and for them. And again, the big reminder though is this hardship is happening whether or not I want it to, whether or not I say anything. And the kindest thing, if I put myself in their shoes, is the kindest thing I can do is to be real with them and kind with them. If I duck out and if I chicken out and don't tell them the truth, well, then I'm wasting their time. Then I'm not giving them the ability to live honestly with what time they have, and potentially to waste a bunch of time pursuing treatments that I know won't help. And that sounds even harder to me than the idea of telling them the truth. And so there's my self-talk. I go around in those
Okay.
loops a few times, and that's what sort of then I'm ready to go into that room.
Gotcha. Now, how about children? How should we talk about death with our kids?
Hmm. Well, here too, how we raise our children, there's a sort of a developmental science to it. So, you might say there's biology, but there's also culture. So, different cultures do all this stuff differently. So I just want to acknowledge there isn't an objectively right way. So I
What
don't
are
want,
some
I,
like best practices that,
yeah,
you've seen that work better than others?
yeah. Well, so that best practice includes acknowledging these cultural differences. So
Okay.
making sure I know the family that I'm talking to, and if I can have a chance to get to know them and where they're coming from and what language lights up for them, that would be a good standard of care, to be sensitive to how they see the world. But even if I don't have any of that information, whatever, best practices these days from a bioethics point of view and a human development point of view, basically the gist is just be plain and honest about it. That we get into trouble when we're euphemizing, when we avoid the word death. Like the classic things are like, oh, grandma's gone to a better place.
Right.
That might sound kind in the short term, that a young mind might hear that more sweetly than grandma's dying. But the truth is that sends a signal to that kid that the truth can't be discussed. And it also says literally like your grandma is leaving you to go someplace she'd rather be. Like, wait, why isn't grandma
Yeah,
taking me
right,
with? Why am
right,
I so you get into trouble when you're just less direct. So standards of care would say be direct, be kind, but be plain. Use the death word. Say what's actually happening. The kids are smart and they pick up on it when we're bullshitting them. And secondly, tears, heartache, sorrow, that's part of normal life. You can model to a child what it means to be sad. So the idea of stiff upper lip, buck up, don't, personally, I've tried that route and it hurts more down the road. It doesn't help, it hurts more. So I'm not a fan of that, but everyone does their own thing. But in general, that's sort of the standard of care. Be plain spoken, be honest, emote genuinely, and let a kid tell you what they need. Kids are smart. So if a kid wants to leave the room, let them. If a
sure.
kid would like to bring someone with them, let them within reason. They're telling you what they need. Um, Now that's the general overview. All right. And so oftentimes I've heard so many sad stories about like a parent, like a grown person now reflecting on their childhood when their mom or dad didn't want them to see so and so because the last memory would be them in the hospital and they wanted to protect the last memory for the
Hmm,
kid so the kid didn't get to say goodbye to granny or whoever it was.
sure.
That is almost always conceived later in life as a tragedy, as a problem, as
Mm,
a extra layer of pain, not something that was helpful to them, as
o-
a general rule.
okay.
So that's the gist. There are some subtypes of what, so a 4-year-old mind is different from a 9-year-old's mind.
Right.
So there's some developmental stations in here to be sensitive to. Um, and so there's some more details in the particulars of various ages, but that's the general gist. And I would
Okay.
say in general, if families or people are wondering how to talk to kids, there's a really cool specialty called child life specialists. And child life specialists are often nurses or social workers who get extra training in this sort of developmental scope of
Mm,
kids and how to
okay.
talk with kids. And child life specialists can do all sorts of good stuff in the mix here. So if a family is wondering how to get help discussing or supporting a kid, ask around for child life specialists.
You took the words out of my mouth because my next question was, is there any books or anything else that you could think of to help out with this? So I think
For
the answer,
kids
yeah.
specifically,
Well, yeah, or for parents to help
mm,
the kids. You know,
yeah, yeah. Well, I bet there are books specifically on this phenomenon, but sad to say I don't know them. But I would start by Googling child life specialists,
child life.
pediatric
Okay.
palliative care programs.
Oh, okay.
They will all be much more versed in this than I am. I'm sure those resources exist. I just don't have anything in mind to point you to.
Yeah, and don't say grandma's sleeping. That's not good.
Yeah,
That's
no,
that's very bad because I've heard then that kids don't want to go to sleep at night because
exactly,
they don't want to wind up like grandma. So, yeah, not a
exactly,
good idea.
exactly.
All right, regrets. You often hear about that in hospice. People in their last days, you know, there are there's there might be or there are common themes with regrets. What are some that you have heard to kind of help us live a better life so we don't have these regrets?
Yeah. Great. It's a two-step process, and as far as I can tell. First step is commit to getting real. Commit to trying to find your way to reality. I'm not suggesting that you love death or love illness. Some people find their way to an experience of say, like cancer was the greatest thing to happen to me, or amputations was the greatest thing to happen to me. I get that point of view. A lot of good can flow from these otherwise hard examples. But let me just say, one way or another, I think your first step is committing as a person in this world to trying to find your way to the fullest sense of reality that you can, to be real with yourself, to be real with life. And for my money, that's the best way to welcome death into the view. I don't love death, but I love life, and life includes death, so therefore I love death.
Okay.
So I love, you know what I mean? So find one way or another, find yourself in a worldview, pursue a worldview that can accommodate the entirety of the lived experience. You don't have to kick things out of your frame of view to be okay. So if one is committing to that fuller scope. And once you can now look at death or suffering or illness a little bit more honestly, well, then you can start saying, oh, right. Well, then you can welcome the truths in. And the truth of death is, oh, right, I'm not going to be here forever. You know, that is the very thing that sanctions me to make decisions of saying yes to some things and no to other things. That otherwise, if I live forever, I'll do everything at some point, whatever, just keep it coming. But the fact of my death forces me to get serious about the decisions I make. So once you do that, then you can start avoiding regret by making better decisions for yourself, in this way that accommodate this reality of life and death. So that's a way to minimize regrets in a way, to make better decisions from this fuller place. And now there comes the second step. The second step is, you know what? We're still human beings. We're still going to forget that we die, and we're still going to wish to do things that we can't do, et cetera, et cetera. So in other words, regret's going to happen no matter how great a decision maker you are. Because if you go left, you're going to always wonder what would have happened if you had gone right.
Sure.
It's just part of the human experience. So make friends with regret, make friends with fear too, to the degree you can. I don't know that it's possible to live a life without fear. I don't know that it's possible to live a life without regret. Let's minimize fear. Let's minimize regret. Let's minimize suffering that's unnecessary. And let's also get better at suffering when we just have no choice.
Very well
That's
put.
my two-step process.
Okay. In the same vein, since I was a cop for 25 years, did you ever have a patient give a dying declaration to a serious crime? And if so, what did you do with that?
I have not. No, so I have not. I've just been told stories basically about from family members that they found out, about an affair that a parent was having or a whole second suite of kids and some other, I've heard of sort of deathbed secrets coming out, but
Yeah.
they've never been delivered into my ear before.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right. Well, let's start wrapping this up. And I do appreciate you hanging in here for a while. So,
Yeah, it's great talking to you.
who takes care of the people, including yourself, who takes care of everyone else? It's a heavy topic. I would think employee turnover is huge, burnout. When you're dealing with such a heavy thing, every day you get slapped over the head with it. And I didn't think about this until I read the book Weekends at Bellevue by Julie Holland. She was a doctor she was in charge of the psych ward at Bellevue Hospital in New York. And she would check in on Friday and she wouldn't leave until Monday. And just the stories that she had, and
Yeah.
her mentor who was training her says, you're going to need therapy. And she's like, well, BS, I don't need therapy. And she's a psychologist, and she's like, you know what, I'm very strong, blah, 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 I'll be just fine. Well, she wasn't just fine. And it almost cashed her in, but she did very well. She acknowledged it and she got some help, and it's a really good book, and I would love to talk to her someday. I really admired her. So along that vein, who does take care of you? And what do you do for self-preservation and doctors like you?
Well, it's a great question, and my answer is a work in progress. I, like many people in healthcare, have struggled to find a balance, and I have teetered on burnout. So there's a lot to say. This is very much a work in progress. If we talked again in a year, my answer might be a little different. So I just reserve the right. I still struggle with this question. So it's an ongoing one. I will say a couple thoughts. So one is, like we've done a little bit one way and another, is to depathologize hardship. Just because, therapy it can be a wonderful thing. You don't have to be depressed. You don't have to be mentally ill to benefit from therapy. You don't have to be mentally ill to be struggling in this life. Life is actually hard. We got to disabuse ourselves that normalcy is happiness. That anything other than just happiness is a detour or something's wrong. No, it's no, that life is way. So one for myself is it's going back to how do I hold these experiences? So for me, it's very important to depathologize these normal experiences. And so that lowers the barrier of entry for me to get help with therapy. I re-entered therapy for probably the fifth time in my life recently. It's been great. I find it very useful. I don't think I qualify as being mentally ill, but I'm still benefiting from therapy. So
Sure.
that's one thing. I think the other things that we know help push back on burnout is some sort of reflective practice. It could be yoga, it can be prayer, it can be meditation, it can be writing. It doesn't matter what, but that you have some method that you routinely process your experience and work with it in an artistic way or creative way or prayer or whatever it is. So having some sort of reflective practice that allows you to metabolize life as it goes, I think is very, very important. Grieving, it turns out, is extremely important. I'm around loss a lot.
Yeah.
That means I've got to carry around a lot of grief. So I need to get really sort of pretty, savvy at grieving. So I spend some of every day in grief now. And I think that's the relief. That gives me a place, a kind of a ritual where I can hold my heartaches and normalize them and live with them. So grief has been very, very powerful. And then another thing we know helps is sharing it. So talking with another person, family member, friend, colleague, whatever else. Um, well, a lot of us end up feeling very much alone with these experiences. And we make the mistake of assuming that we are alone, but that's just not true. We are not alone. We are actually connected. And everyone is having some experience like that. Like we're all, alone somewhere inside ourselves. So there's a that a feeling of aloneness. I'm very careful to not take the bait. I understand that I have that feeling, and I also find my way to remind myself that it's just not true. So that's reaching out to family or friends or to animals that I've lived with or talking to a tree is just basically feeling the connections that already exist is very, very key. So in that suite of answers is what I do one day to the next, and it's a work in progress. It's tricky to right size yourself in all this work to be in front of sort of in a distorted way to be around so much suffering and sadness and so much loss. Well, to rebalance, I got to remind myself of the gain and the joys and the learnings and so I get outside a lot. Mother Nature helps me a lot.
Sure.
So anyway, there's my answer. But again, I'm very much a work in progress, Patrick.
Work in progress. I think that's a good place for us to stop. You know
Yeah,
what?
yeah.
Th Thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Miller. This has been amazing. Where can people learn more about you and your work?
Well, Patrick, let's see here. So Mental Health, Mettle, mentalhealth.com is the practice my partner Sonia Dolan and I started at the beginning of the pandemic. It's basically palliative care counseling and coaching online.
Oh, okay.
And you can find us on our website there. Come see us as you like. We do free webinars and cool things like that, or come talk to us if you'd like, be a client. So mentalhealth.com is important. Or the book Shoshana Berger and I wrote together called A Beginner's Guide to the End. You can get that at most bookstores, Amazon. Simon and Schuster published that in 2019. Um, Twitter, I'm at BJ Miller MD. I'm not on there often, but you can find me there. And then Instagram, we're at Mental Health is where you
Okay.
can find us on Instagram.
Well, very good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again so much. This has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Patrick. I really appreciate you, buddy, for the work you've done and the work you're currently doing. And my best to your audience. Life will get better and easier if more and more of us are having conversations like this. So thank you for daring.
All right. Thank you.